You're listening to the Nerd to Know Media Network. Join us at nerdtoknowmedia.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, it's now time for our main event. Take a trip back in time to the golden era of the wrestling world with your host, Chris Techrold Blade. Welcome to Once Upon a Turnbuckle.
Hi everyone, and I can finally say, after a bit of an extended rest, welcome back to a brand new episode, a brand new era as it is of Once Upon a Turnbuckle. And I couldn't think of a better way to kick it off, if I'm honest. I've got a real kind of bucket list guest of mine who's joining me today. Not only a New York Times best-selling author, not only a TV producer, but any wrestling fan of my era worth their salt will know this guy from his time writing for over 20 years for the WWF WWE magazine. Keith Elliot Greenberg, welcome to the show, mate.
Thanks for inviting me on the show, Chris.
Oh, no, I couldn't pass up this opportunity, really. It's we'll touch on a few things. One of the main things that I've put in the intro, obviously your time with WWF magazine. I grew up with that. That was, the magazine was what I lived by. It was like my Bible. So when I saw your name flash up and the opportunity to at least get in touch, couldn't pass it up. So it's great to have you. So
thank you. And it's such a strange thing because, like, for my next book, I interviewed Nick Aldis, and he goes, "Oh, I remember like seeing your name in the magazine when I was a little kid." First of all, it's hard to imagine Nick Aldis as a little kid.
No.
It's also bizarre because I don't really see myself as being older than I was 25 or 30 years ago.
Sure.
So to think of a generation of people who were reading my stuff, it seems like yesterday I just became a professional writer.
There you go. And that's what they say about what you're when you're having fun or when you're doing something that you love. It's not work, is it? So
it doesn't feel like work to me.
No, that's cool.
Because even the most stressful times are still fun times.
Yeah. And the product you get at the end, I'm sure, is well worth
all the time, effort, and stress. Remember it. And you're in the UK, so I don't know if you're familiar with Inside the Ropes magazine.
Somewhat, yeah. I've seen it around. I don't. I'm not much of a follower of the new stuff, so I must admit I don't buy magazines anymore, but I have seen it. The one thing that drew me to it is the fact that the way the front covers are done, if they still do it like it is very much like the old WWF magazine.
It is. I mean, it's really in some ways like, here's a recent issue. It's a tribute to the newsstand magazines of the past. But what's interesting is they were created during COVID when everyone was locked down. It was a very ambitious undertaking. But I'm writing a column for them every month. And I actually said to Dante Richardson, the editor-in-chief, I said, look, if somehow all my WWF magazine stuff blew up, it wasn't around anymore, and all people had to remember me by was this newer stuff, I'm okay with that.
Absolutely.
So, so it's still, you can still make your passion for the industry exciting, no matter how many years pass. Now, that's not true of everybody. If you are a wrestler, unless you are a creative force backstage, at some point your body will break down. Yeah. And even some of the photographers, I look at these guys, at the pay-per-view shows, or as WWE now calls them, premium events. And, I know these guys for a long time, for a generation, and they're bending and twisting their bodies, and I'm sure they must feel the aches and pains in doing it.
Yeah, but no, it's good. I mean, to say, I think writing is one of those great things. I I'm a writer as well, not quite as, prolific and successful as yourself, but it's definitely an avenue where I lose myself, and I don't think that will ever get old.
No, it doesn't get old. Yeah.
So let's sort of touch on where this started. So what came first, writing or wrestling? What were you kind of into first?
Well, wrestling came first in my life. Writing about wrestling came after I became a professional writer.
Sure.
But I became a professional writer at 19.
Okay.
And it was professional wrestling was one topic that I knew more about than other people. And, you go back, 19 was when I was 19, that was 1978. So once I gravitated toward the wrestling business, there weren't a lot of educated wrestling fans out there. I grew up in an era when wrestling was really marketed for the unwashed masses. And, so it was a novelty.
Yeah.
It's somebody who was a working journalist, knew so much about wrestling.
Yeah.
And nowadays, of course, you have people who grew up in the Attitude Era, and prior to that, the Hulk Hogan era. So basically, you have two generations of educated wrestling fans. And that's something that should really be credited to Vince McMahon, because he did change the perception of this thing of ours. And, as a result, it brought in a different type of fan and a different type of appreciation of the art.
Yeah. Oh, that's a beautiful way of saying it. For Vince McMahon, for anyone who trashes him, I've done it as well, for certain things that he's doing to the product these days, whether you love it or hate it. I mean, he is the one responsible for what it is, really. You can't sort of, you can't get away from that. What was your experience working in the WWF, and when did that begin? How did that start firstly?
That started, and it's so funny because last week I actually ran into the person who got me into WWE. Ed Schutte was the editor of the WWF magazine, and we were both at the first WrestleMania. And I was writing an article for Us Weekly, which still exists in the US. And we were just talking, and Ed had boxed, and Ed still is a martial artist. But he appreciated the fighting arts, and he had respect for what the wrestlers put into this, and had a very good rapport with the wrestlers. Yeah. So, but he was also a guy who had covered ivory smuggling in, Kenya, and this was a guy who had covered the race riots in the United States in the 1960s. Yeah. So this was a guy who had covered Iran during the time of the Shah. So again, he was an erudite, educated man who used all that, channeled all that into his wrestling writing. Okay. So we immediately had a rapport, the two of us. And he suggested, why don't you start writing for us? And as I said in a social media post after we ran into each other, so I did, and I'm still reaping the benefits.
And that was, when was it that you then broke? When did you start with WWF? Just sort of set the scene.
That would be 85, right after.
So right then, wow.
Movie. And I remember he brought me backstage to a TV taping. And Vince McMahon knew who I was because I had interviewed him, numerous times for other publications. Yeah. And I think he even might have remembered me from when I was just a fanatical fan, because at the root of everybody in this business, generally, you have a fanatical fan. Yeah. And so I remember he gave Ed a look like, what's this guy doing backstage? Like, who let this Mark in here? And he said, no, he's writing for us now. And Vince was pacified, and that was that.
As long as you weren't a threat, I suppose. And I think your tenure, how long were you there? It was over 20 years.
22 years. But, here's the deal there. I was there 22 years. That's a long run. Anyway. And I was never full-time. I was always a freelancer. Yeah. So I was on retainer for them, which was great because they'd say, here are your 3 or 4 stories for the month. And I would write those. And sometimes they'd say, look, something else came up. We need you to write this in a hurry, which I, generally did.
Yeah.
And once in a while, they'd even throw me a little extra money because there'd be an annual report or something. That needed
Okay.
to-
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a great gig. And in fact, there was always extra money I was being thrown. And that's part of the reason I think I was shown the door after 22 years, because a new publisher came in. And he goes, I've never seen this guy in the office once. And we paid this guy this amount of money this year. Because every year they would also give me a raise.
I see.
And I knew the day was coming. And the
Wow.
guy said, look, for the amount we're paying you now, I can hire 2 recent college graduates.
Right.
And I'm like, no argument there. And he said, I will continue throwing you freelance though. And they did.
Cool.
So I never had a falling out with them. You know, I worked on 2 editions of the WWE Encyclopedia. You know, through the years, I've been given other projects. So yes, the books I've written most recently are not WWE sponsored books. And I can't wait for those guys to gift me an assignment.
Sure.
But, you know, I cover WrestleMania for Inside the Ropes, and I cover other events for Inside the Ropes. And, you know, so I have nothing to complain about.
I think that's credited to your quality of writing, your tenure there, whatever it is, probably amalgamation of both. You have the name recognition within the industry. Certainly, you know, like I say, I haven't picked up a wrestling magazine new release probably for about 20 years. But I remember you. I remember your name because, you know, like I say, it was pretty much my life for the 10 or 15 years that I did follow it as a kid.
I mean, you know, look, I remember my reaction the first time I met Bill Apter.
All right.
And, you know, Bill Apter, for those who don't know, I mean, how could anyone not know?
No. It's a wrestling show. I think everyone's familiar
in this world who don't. But he was, you know, both a photographer and a columnist for the family of magazines that would eventually include PWI, Pro Wrestling Illustrated. And I can recall being a young guy and meeting Bill Apter. And he's like, oh, you live in Queens? I live in Queens. Let's exchange phone numbers. And I remember looking at the phone number and thinking, I have Bill Apter's phone number. It's going to get good now.
Absolutely. But so interestingly, actually, just come to mind, was there ever any opportunities back then, if you were freelance for the WWF, could you have written for publications like PWI? And
Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not. No. There was no way we could. That was the competition. And in fact, the corporate line was, and it was not nearly as corporate as it is now, but it was still corporate, was there is only one wrestling magazine, the WWF magazine. Now, that doesn't mean my friendships with all those other people went away.
No.
They certainly did not. But they weren't even allowed to take photos at the building. The Japanese photographers were for the weekly Japanese magazines. And that was to my benefit because 2 of those guys, Keiji Nakayama and Shun Yamaguchi, became 2 of my closest friends. You know, in fact, you know, before COVID came in, I was planning to visit Cage in Japan, and I still hope to do that within the next few months.
Oh, that'd be great, wouldn't it? Yeah. The Japanese, I've always been amazed by the Japanese side of wrestling. It was one that I never really got into enough back then, but it's probably, out of everything that's going on nowadays, it's probably the one that I could definitely dive back into.
Well, and there's a combination. You know, you have this new pay-per-view coming up, Forbidden Door, which is a dual AEW and New Japan pay-per-view.
Yeah.
That will be in Chicago. And, you know, there are some great talents there. And I will give AEW credit. They've been bringing in, you know, legends like Minoru Suzuki and Ishii Takamori. I hope I pronounced that right.
I'm not in a position to correct you. So,
but you know, they've just been bringing in some, and the females. You know, Haru Saki is I'm mangling the names. Riho, but great women have been brought in. So.
Is that one major change? If you obviously you're still writing about wrestling nowadays, you know, the women's scene from back when you started.
Oh, certainly, now? Because, you know, I can remember when I was, I'm just looking up the name to make sure. I definitely mangled one of the names, so
I won't
forgive.
worry.
Anyway, yeah, the women's scene certainly, because women were considered at best when I started out garnish on the shows,
Yeah.
but they weren't the show. And of course, now it's standard fare. You watch WWE and the show ends. Monday Night Raw this week, it ended with a women's match, creating intrigue towards the next pay-per-view or premium event is WWE.
I won't be able to get used to that. I'm still
and
used to me.
and that's standard. No one says, "Wow, history's been made."
No, and I think back when I watched it, you'd be lucky if you got one match every 3 months on TV for that.
Yeah.
So, I've got to throw a couple of obvious ones, sort of, sticking with your time with WWF. I will call it WWF because it was back then.
Whatever, it was WWF at the time.
It always was to me. Can you remember what your first feature was that you wrote?
I don't. Yeah. There were so many.
Yeah.
No, I don't remember what my first.
Probably a bit of an easy one there. Any sort of memorable ones that stick with you, sort of your favorite ones or ones that come with a particular?
So it was Tomohiro Ishii. Tomohiro Ishii. So I mispronounced the name.
Don't worry about it.
I now stand to be corrected. This is bizarre, but I've been asked about this over the years. When Randy Savage and Elizabeth split up, I was fairly friendly with Randy Savage, and there wasn't an internet then, so WWE felt the need to acknowledge this since they were a key part of storylines and had in fact gotten married in the ring. Now they'd been married for years prior to that, but Elizabeth suddenly wasn't in the picture anymore. And Randy Savage caught me backstage and he said, you're the one who I want to explain this. And it was, very respectful, very heartfelt. Didn't go into details, and it shouldn't have. But it was, unfortunately, we've chosen to go our separate ways, and we'll always have affection for each other, along those lines. I can remember another time, and I think I recently brought this up on a podcast. It was a Survivor Series, and right before that Survivor Series, Bret Hart had a brother who died. Dean was his name, and he had had health problems his entire life. He'd been a referee. He'd never been a wrestler. And Bret once told me he thought that Dean was the bravest of all of the Harts because he dealt with, physical adversity his entire life. And Gorilla Monsoon during that Survivor Series said, wow, Bret's here in the ring and his brother just died a night or two earlier. And, it's amazing that he's such a fierce competitor that he showed up and he's wrestling. And I was impressed with that, or at least I made mental note of it. And when I wrote up the article, I mentioned that. And Bret saw the article and he came over to Ed Raschuti and he said, why are you mentioning my brother's death in a wrestling story? That's a very personal thing. And Ed actually covered for me and made it seem as if he had done it and apologized. But I was more than willing to apologize to Bret personally because I knew Bret. And certainly the last thing I would have wanted to have done would have been to hurt him. But, it's not like I could have texted him and said, is this all? And also my feeling was the announcers already said it on TV. So I figured if it's on TV, it's okay to write about.
Yeah, fair enough. Did he gave the impression that he wasn't happy about it? So I thought it would have been something.
He absolutely wasn't happy about it. And, and he had every right to say what he felt. And, and I would have been more than happy to, discuss it with him and express, I don't like to apologize when I'm not wrong, but I certainly would have apologized for that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. Were there any? Obviously, you have to kind of remain professional, while you're in a place like that. Were there any guys that you wrote about, that you worked with, that you really marked out, or you tried hard not to mark out?
Bruno. I'd met Bruno prior to Bruno Sammartino, who were born, long after I was. But Bruno Sammartino was the champ on and off from 1963 to, I believe, 1974 or so. And I could be mistaken. I'm pretty certain.
He had a good run. Yeah.
Sorry. He lost the title. He lost the title to Superstar Billy Graham in 77. So it was 63 to 77. Now, again, there was a gap in there when Pedro Morales was the champ, I believe, from 71 to 74. And then Bruno was the champ again. And again, I may have gotten that date wrong. By the way, the Japanese female whose name I mangles is Hikaru Shida. So I've now corrected myself. So I don't want anyone going online and saying this guy is so ignorant he can't pronounce Japanese names properly. But I had met Bruno prior to working for WWE. But whenever I was near Bruno, I felt his aura. And that certainly comes from idolizing him as a kid. And Freddie Blassie, who I'd also met prior to working for them. And I ended up writing Freddie Blassie's autobiography. And Freddie Blassie was my favorite wrestler growing up, because we used to get wrestling from Los Angeles in Spanish in New York. There was a network on UHF. Did you have UHF in the UK?
Not that I know of, no. I might be wrong though. I only got it in
there were two dials on the television. One was the major channels, and the other were these staticky channels. UHF. It was another frequency.
Yeah.
And you could turn the dial back and forth and try to get the image in focus. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't.
I know what you mean.
But we used to get professional wrestling in Spanish from the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, and Blassie was my favorite wrestler. So to eventually write his book, it was really a privilege. And sometimes when I read that book now, I mean, not that I read it from cover to cover, but when I look through it, I still feel the excitement that I had when I was writing.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. I was going to ask anyway, actually, in terms of what you write, because obviously you've written, so much over the years. Is there a difference between when you're commissioned something, you're asked, write about this, and when you pick something up of something that you want, that you're passionate about?
Naturally. That doesn't mean that I don't feel proud of what I've been commissioned to write. For instance, Inside the Ropes recently asked me to do a story about diversity in wrestling. Okay. And so I wrote about the treatments of and the depictions of various minorities throughout the years, most prominently African Americans or black wrestlers, because I think I might have mentioned Johnny Quango in there, and he was in the UK, and as well as gay wrestlers. And now, I interviewed a guy called my apologies. And I have a trans child also, so I should know better than using that term, but a competitor called the Dark Sheik, who is trans. So I did get a variety of perspectives, but I also delved into history and offered my perspective. Yeah. And so even though that was assigned to me, I took it very seriously. And I think it's in the UK, you can get that issue on the stands now. It's the WrestleMania issue. And I was quite proud of that.
I'll look for that. Awesome. Let's talk about your books then, stepping away from, obviously you like you touched on, you've been involved in some autobiographies with Freddie Blassie, Superstar Billy Graham, Ric Flair as well. Am I right in thinking?
And the unpublished Iron Sheik.
I know. If there was a book out there that all of us want to have and want to be out there, it's probably that one.
And what's so bizarre is, no one ever explained this to me explicitly, but I was told the stories were just so off color from the Iron Sheik that WWE couldn't justify putting this out there. And it's like, I know some high executive asked, how does this help our brand? And, if you're peddling the brand as something that puts smiles on people's faces, well, it puts smiles on people's faces, but not the kinds of smiles they necessarily want. But I just participated in an A&E biography on the Iron Sheik. And the producer said to me when he interviewed me that WWE provided them a copy of that book. So even though the book was never released, there are copies circulating around One Titan Tower, which I didn't know about. And when my last book came out, Too Sweet Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution, a fan contacted me and told me he had a copy of the Iron Sheik book. And I said, how can that be? It was never released. And he said there were some preliminary versions that were sent to media, which I didn't know about. Yeah. And he had one. I think he said he had paid like $700 US for it. And if I'm correct, he resold it for like $1,200 US. Now, I'm not that kind of a hustler.
No.
And if I was, I'd probably get caught doing that. So, I wouldn't do that. But it did make me think.
It's worth money. I hear the Gary Hart biography or autobiography.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of those, it's in like quite short supply. It was at some point.
Yes, I found it. I found it online at one point, and I even put it on my desktop. So, if I was working on something else and I needed a break, I'd read a couple of pages.
So say, in the end, if that was like the holy grail of autobiographies,
it was wonderful bio. And I'll tell you this, I'm going to recommend my friend Brian Solomon, who I work with at WWE magazines. He just wrote a book on the original Sheik, and I'm reading it for the second time. It's so good and it's so detailed.
Cool. Okay, and that's a guy actually I don't know a hell of a lot about. So I may well, I love picking up.
It's really a worthwhile read because it's all. I mean, Brian can say it more articulately than I can, but he's a guy who really lived kayfabe. I mean, he avoided speaking English in public, and there's a great story in the book, and I'll let Brian tell you the rest, where he's in a car towards the end of his life, and well, not the end of his life, but he's older now. He's in a car with Sabu, his nephew, and there's some fan driving them somewhere. And the fan said, wow, I enjoyed your match tonight, but even though you can't move, and it's too bad when you threw that fireball, you missed. And from the back seat, he threw a fireball at the back of the guy's head and said, in perfect English, I didn't miss now.
Brilliant. And what a time to use that as well. That's amazing.
Yeah. But there's very few, I don't think anybody kayfabes to that degree now, even MJF.
No. How has that affected your writing then? Because you obviously, when you started writing, it was kayfabe was still very strong through like the 80s and some of the 90s. But now, I mean, everyone's got their own level of knowledge about it. How does that impact how you write about it now?
Well, it depends who I'm writing for, obviously. I have done projects over the years to promote WWE events. And when I do that, I write as if these are life and death battles.
Sure.
When I'm writing, say, an article or a book, my essential tone is, you and I both know that this is entertainment. We also know it's grueling. We also know people sacrifice their lives for this. We know they live with injuries for their entire lives, and they get divorced because wrestling takes precedence over everything.
Yeah.
And, so we appreciate what these people do. And that's the spirit in which this is being written.
Brilliant. And again, I don't think it's people just my age that would appreciate that. I mean, I'd like to
I
think
mean,
the new
I think
generation would as
most
well.
people, I write for fans who are analytical wrestling fans, just like if you were, the difference is like people say, well, it's like acting. Well, it's a little different because in acting, I don't think Marlon Brando acted like Don Corleone when he was in public. He had some other, eccentricities, but not that. And, The Undertaker, even though he was, I saw him do a tribute to the US troops in Iraq. And after the show was over, he went into the crowd and just sat with guys and was talking with them as long as they wanted to speak, as Mark Calloway. He wasn't talking like The Undertaker. But there is a certain amount of maintaining your character that you're not pressured to do if you're in Hollywood. And that's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And then there's other guys who just drop the character when the show is over, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
It's what works for you and what works for your character.
They got a little bit more freedom these days than they probably used to.
I'd imagine. I'm not sure if there are certain performers who are told, do not let your guard down. I know that Roman Reigns recently cut a promo after a show in his hometown, and he switched to just regular guy, baby face. I'm from here, you're from here.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody backstage was particularly angry at him for doing that. Again, he's Roman Reigns. I don't know if Ricochet did that. Maybe he would have had more of a difficult time after the show.
Maybe, but yeah, Roman is God at the minute, isn't he? I think for a long time yet. Yeah. Listen, Keith, I know we need to probably wrap it up a little bit because I know you're a very, very busy man. I really do appreciate you coming on. I do just want to sort of touch on, give you the floor for a couple of minutes. Let everyone know where they can find you if they want to find out more about what you're doing, and also your latest book as well that I know you've recently come out.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. My latest book, which will be out in the fall, is called Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19. Essentially, it deals with what we all lived through the last few years. And it's juxtaposed with real life events that were occurring, including the American presidential election, which resembled some of the more bizarre angles, maybe from the Herb Abrams era of professional wrestling. And then, as well as Brexit. And I think the review from Bild, the German magazine, was, Boris Johnson, Kenny Omega, Brock Lesnar, and Donald Trump all in one book. Yes. So, but it's essentially about how professional wrestling continued when the rest of the world shut down. In some ways, that was a service to all of us. And once again, it's another example of the titans of the squared circle sacrificing their own health for the rest of us. And that's why when people say, is wrestling real? Well, as the saying goes, it's real to me.
Yeah.
So follow the buzzards Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19 is being published by ECW Press, which stands for, initially stood for, I believe, Encyclopedia of Canadian Writing, not Extreme.
Okay, I was going to, before everyone gets excited. Yeah.
And it's being published by ECW Press. You can find it on their website, and I believe it is on Amazon UK, and is also on Amazon in the US, and probably a few other places. I believe it's also Barnes and Noble has it, and probably, what is the big bookstore in the UK? Because I once did a signing at one of them.
Waterstones is probably the biggest.
Waterstones, yeah, I think you can find it there too.
Cool.
So pre-order it. I could use the money.
Hey, I'll definitely be doing that.
And on social media, I can be found on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, Keith Elliot Greenberg. And Keith, Elliot, Elliot, Greenberg, Greenberg. Look me up on any of those and you can find me. I'm kind of running, I think Facebook has a limit. You can only have like 5,000 Facebook friends.
I think so, yeah.
And I'm up to like 4,800 something. But that still gives me, over 1,000, over 100 to friends. And then Instagram, I'm still building my following there. I just went on there in 2020 when my last book, Too Sweet Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution, came out. And Twitter also, I'm building a following.
There you go. I'm still trying to get my head around it all. I've just moved on to TikTok as well. Anyone who's watching this.
I haven't done that yet.
No, I don't know. I still don't know sort of where I'm going to go with it, but it's, it's another string to the bow, isn't it?
I mean, I have an 18-year-old daughter. Sometimes I'll see she's like, hanging around a particular guy. I'll go, what does he do? She goes, well, he wants to be a professional Twitch performer and play video games and get money for it.
Of course.
Best of luck to
him. This is where hobbies become careers, isn't it?
And then look, but who am I to argue against that? Because would anyone have believed that I could have earned a living writing about professional wrestling? No.
Probably not.
And look at us.
There you go. And I got to say, thanks again. You're such an inspiration. As a childhood wrestling fan and a writer, it's the one thing that I would love to have been able to do. Because I'm fixated on one particular era, I think it really limits my ability to do it, which is why the podcast is so fantastic for kind of going down memory lane. But, thanks for the memories.
A pleasure. And, call me back when my book comes out in the fall. I'm overjoyed to come back, Chris.
We'll do that. Absolutely. Listen, Keith, thank you so much. All the best with everything you've got coming up. We will speak again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
See you again soon.
Good. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to a Nerd to Know Media production.